Австралийн Welcome.
Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр ороо манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор монголчуудын сайн танил найз Монгол улсад сууж байсан Америк-Монголын улсын элчин сайд Хатагтай Памела Слүц оролцож байна.
Памела Слүц Умард Америк-Монголын бизнесийн зөвлөлийн удирдах зөвлөлийн дарга 2003-аас 2006 оны хооронд Монгол улс дахь Америк-Монголын улсын элчин сайдаар ажиллаж байсан. Дараа нь Кени, Бурунди улс дахь элчин сайдын яаманд ажилласан. Америк-Монголын улсын дипломат албанд 31 жилийн турш ажиллахдаа голцуу, Зүүн Өмнөд Ази, Зүүн Азийн улс орнуудад ажиллаж байсан. 2005 оны 11-р сард Америк-Монголын улсын ерөнхийлөгч Жорж Бушийн Монгол дахь анхны түүхэн ажлыг зохион байгуулж байсан. Хоолон их сургуулийг улс төр судлалаар бакалавр, хаваан их сургуулийг Аз судлал, улс төрийн шинжлэх ухааны мастер зэрэгтэй төгссөн. Франц, Индонез, мандарин хэлтэй. Нөхрийн хамт Техас мужийн Кервил хотод амьдарч байна.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to Mongolia back.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back again.
So this time you are in different capacity.
I am. I retired from the U.S. Foreign Service last year, and my first thought was, how can I re-engage with Mongolia?
Okay.
As during my service here as ambassador, it was, I think, the highlight of my career. So when the opportunity presented itself to become the chairman of the North America Mongolia Business Council, I accepted.
Well,
And,
that's so fascinating. It's a great pleasure also for us to see our old friend, to be in charge of a big mission at this time, critical time for our Mongolian economic development. And let's talk about a little bit about your time when you are the only U.S. ambassador who hosted the U.S. president on this soil.
Yes, yes.
How was it?
So I said my 3 years here, I think, was unusual. And it was largely due to Mongolia's contribution to you say, action in Afghanistan and Iraq. As you know, Mongolia put peacekeepers on the ground in Iraq. That was one of the things that brought us together. But I think also President Bush, who was president at the time, had a great regard for the development of democracy here in Mongolia. Mongolia was, as we say, the poster child for democracy. For instance, Mongolia was the only Asian country in the first round for the Millennium Challenge account. Mongolia was the only country that passed the tests. And again, that was a program initiated by President Bush. So when he decided to come and cap the success, it was a great honor. November 2005, I remember it was a week before Thanksgiving. And we were all very concerned it was going to be bitter cold. But actually the weather cooperated quite nicely.
It was a great day, I think. Millennium Challenge account. Recently, by the way, as we speak of, they have been closing because they have done their mission.
Yeah, right.
And I think if President Bush consider now the result, will be happy.
Yes, I think so. I think so. Of course, it was up to Mongolia to choose the projects. We were, Millennium Challenge account was the financier, the banker for the projects. It did take a while to decide which projects to work on, but I think my understanding is at the end of the 5 years, it's been a quite successful program, and I hope at some point Mongolia will be eligible again for a second compact if that's suitable.
Oh, I see.
There is a possibility of a follow-on, providing there's money and Mongolia continues to make progress.
Well, I hope Mongolia will be qualified. And now Mongolians in particular, to me, I mean, of course, there are some 5-6 projects, but to me it was very remarkable to watch the way how this Millennium Challenge account project corporation helped us to Mongolia to create good basis for vocational training.
Yeah, yes.
Which is the missing part of our education system. And I think it will have a long-lasting effect afterwards. 10 years ago, almost, when you came as a
It was
first
exactly
female.
10 years ago. I presented my credentials to then President Bagban. I think it was September 17th,
Well, almost.
2003.
So it's 10 years. And how do you find today the relationship of two countries 10 years after?
Having talked to Ambassador Campbell, I have to first say that after I left Mongolia in 2006, the State Department sent me to Africa, and I really lost contact with Mongolia. So renewing my knowledge of current affairs has taken me over the last year. I think our relationship, because it's always been solid and based on trust and respect, I think our relationship is very good. And for instance, as Ambassador Campbell noted, in Washington the day before yesterday, Mongolia and the United States signed another agreement, transparency agreement. So I think that's a sign of positive cooperation. And that is part of what we call the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which lays the ground eventually for perhaps a free trade agreement.
You were part of that agreement, negotiations.
I was part of the TIFA, the original, what we call Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which was signed when President Bagban visited Washington in 2004. So I had two occasions.
Yes.
I went to the Oval Office with President Bagban in July of 2004, and then I hosted with President Enkbayer at that time and Prime Minister Elbig-Dorj, the return visit of President Bush. But yes, during the 2004 visit, we signed the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement.
So please tell us about the framework you have, United States has with other countries when we talk about business and trade. First it comes TIFA, right?
Well,
then
actually,
it's transparency agreement, etc. Please tell us about that part.
Well, there are several different layers. Actually, the first agreement we had with Mongolia, and it dates from, I believe, the mid-90s, is a bilateral investment treaty. That was the first step. When I arrived as ambassador in 2003, Mongolia made it very clear they were interested in a free trade agreement. That's a very difficult step because it requires ratification by the U.S. Congress, and it requires a lot of negotiation, and it also requires a high volume of trade between the countries. And frankly, in 2003, there wasn't a high volume of trade between Mongolia and the United States. I know it's increased now, and particularly if we go forward with some of these big mining projects and construction projects, I would hope that the numbers would increase. So the TIFA was a first step. The transparency agreement is another step. I think we need to pause perhaps and digest that and see how Mongolia performs on the transparency. What's important about the transparency is the legal framework.
Okay.
Getting in place a transparent legal framework in Mongolia. For instance, translating draft legislation into English and putting it on the internet so that people can see it before it goes to Parliament.
And you do it with every country, whenever you transfer.
do,
How many
yes.
countries you have already with?
Oh, well, I don't know exactly. However, I do know we have a TIFA with Kenya, Rwanda. We also do it on a regional basis. I was involved in those as well. That's why I know from here I went to Kenya and then to Burundi. And in both countries we were involved in discussions with them.
How do we implement on our side that trade TIFA framework?
The TIFA is basically a consultative process. And so Mongolia has questions, or if we say demands, requests from the United States. And I remember in my time, it had to do with what we call the GSP, the trade preferences. And there was a policy in place, again, I don't know if it's still there, whereby some of Mongolia's exports to the United States, such as handicrafts, and even raw materials, enjoyed a lower tariff.
Okay.
It's called GSP preferential tax treatment. So that's one of the benefits to Mongolia immediately with the TIFA. Again, this is dated because I haven't been current with these arguments. On the other hand, what we're looking for is a stable and predictable investment climate.
Welcome. Yeah, which is also a part of this transparency agreement.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as our foreign minister signed this week, that agreement, transparency agreement, as you said, first of all, require on two sides to be clear on whatever public actions are made in terms of trade, businesses to be publicly declared, disclosed.
Right.
And
particularly draft legislation that has to do with taxation or other business issues.
Yeah, all business taxation issues from the draft to be known by all the stakeholders.
Right, before,
well, that's
part of the consultative process.
That's what the Mongolian's private sector require as well, and I think it helps everybody on two sides.
Exactly.
So now, before we come to this free trade agreement with the United States, do we have any other sort of agreement to be reached? Or it is now...
I have to plead ignorance. I'm not sure what the next step would be. Ambassador Campbell is the one who's...
Probably then in that sense, of course, now we have a little bit higher volume of trade, but I don't think it's to that level that the United States would be particularly interested in, frankly speaking. And hopefully it will be better.
Yes. I think if we can just get the trade volume up, that would help too. So.
You have been a deputy director of Mongolia Chinese office in the State Department.
Yes.
It was 95-97 before. Is it still that department, or do two countries are separate?
It's an interesting story. I've always objected to the inclusion of Mongolia in the Office of Chinese Affairs, and at one point, I actually proposed that the office in charge of we call it the desk, for Mongolia be moved to another office, perhaps with Korea or something else. But even today, it is called the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs, and I think it's one or two officers in that particular office that follow Mongolia. I was the deputy director during an interesting period. And I actually was also the acting Mongolia desk officer, because we really didn't have anyone focused on Mongolia.
Oh, I see.
So my first visit to Mongolia was in 1996 in that capacity. And that's when I decided that this was a place I wanted to actually serve, not just visit.
Okay.
So I persuaded, my husband, Ron Dutch. He was also a Foreign Service officer. We were what's called a tandem. And I persuaded him to bid on, and he succeeded in being the deputy ambassador here from 1997 to 1999.
DCM.
Deputy Chief of Mission, yes.
Yeah, at that time you were in Mongolia as well?
No, our nepotism rules are very strict. So if one member of the couple is either the ambassador or the deputy, the other one cannot work. So I stayed in Washington, but I had many opportunities to come and visit because I had changed jobs already. I was in Washington, but I was in charge of regional affairs. And so my task was to get Mongolia integrated into more of the East Asia organizations, including the ASEAN Regional Forum.
Which is done?
Which is done, yes. I think it was Foreign Minister Tuya represented Mongolia for the first time when Mongolia was granted membership in the ASEAN Regional Forum. And we did other things too. There was not only on the security side, but on the economic side, There's some small organizations that we encouraged we supported Mongolia's membership in these organizations to enable you to integrate more into the East Asia community. Yeah. We also, I know Mongolia has a foot in the east and a foot in the west, and we also supported Mongolia's bid to become what they call partnership for peace with NATO.
Foreign Minister Toya was also only female foreign minister in the country and representing ASEAN.
That's right.
Great story.
The meetings of the ASEAN Regional Forum is usually done at the ministerial level, Minister of Foreign Affairs.
And speaking about women participation in public governance, public administration, you have been playing an interesting role here. And about the women participation in public governance, you have been a part of that project somehow. Please tell us about that. I think our ladies should be listening to their part.
Two areas that I take some pride in, and one is supporting the Center for Nonviolence Against Women. There are at least several shelters now for abused women. We focused on helping women who were victims of domestic violence. So there are several centers here for women who need help. But on the political side, again, when I was ambassador here, it coincided with the effort by the Women's Caucus in Parliament and outside of Parliament to obtain this 30% for women, not only in Parliament, but also in the parties. And
you have certainly succeeded.
I remember we brought the president of the American League of Women Voters here.
Okay.
See, we don't have that system in the United States. We don't set aside 30%. So my hat's off to the Mongolian women for succeeding in that. My only concern was it's easy to get 30% in Parliament, but it's not so easy to get 30% of the leadership positions in the parties. And I'm not sure that women here have actually been able to take senior positions in the political parties.
Except a couple parties, Oyun party.
Well, exactly. That's the big exception, though, I think. Yeah.
You have been you are the probably only ambassador who traveled to every IMAC 2 times at least.
At least twice.
At least twice.
Yes.
And maybe it is also not only associated with your work, but also you are a great fan of Andrews Chapman.
Yes.
Trip to Mongolia. Please tell us about that part.
Well, as a child, I was very interested in dinosaurs and paleontology and expeditions. I read a lot of books, and one that the accounts of Roy Chapman Andrews' expeditions into Mongolia. You know, originally he was looking for prehistoric human fossils, which he never found. But he did find the flaming cliffs and, of course, the famous eggs and the nesting dinosaurs. But that was sort of my first connection with Mongolia. The second connection, of course, was when I got into school reading the history of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. So I think for me, it was always a lifetime ambition to come to Mongolia. And my first trip, in 1996, I went to Dalanzadgad, and I went to the Flaming Cliffs.
Flaming Cliffs. What made you to be not only interested? I mean, what's your, tell us about your family you grew up, your father.
Well, my father was also a diplomat, and I grew up largely overseas in Southeast Asia, in Bangkok, and I chose to specialize in Indonesian affairs, and I did, in fact, do three tours of duty in Indonesia at the embassy in Jakarta. But then I discovered that there was a bigger world out there.
Okay.
The dinosaurs, I think, was many American children. We have dinosaurs in the United States as well. And it's a great source of... it's fascinating, you know, I've actually been out digging for fossils.
Wow,
it's
should be for children fascinating to imagine such a big animal and to understand how is it.
Yeah.
And that's the also here in our recent history, a recent event when we have brought back this batar, we call it now, the dinosaur skeleton.
Right.
which was a great job,
Very
and it
important.
was.
Well, it's your cultural, scientific heritage.
Yeah, we
It
are
should
very
remain
thankful
here.
to the people there, the legal system,
Yeah.
which really made us possible to bring back this treasure we had, and
Yeah.
hopefully Mongolia down the road is another female minister, Oyungira said. Probably we may have a big dinosaurs international world-class museum in this country.
I hope so. I understand that the Natural History Museum is closed. I hope to visit it during this particular visit, but I was told it's closed. I don't.
Welcome. Natural History Museum. I hope it's for restoration. And so you are daughter of diplomat. You have been diplomat. You speak French, Indonesian, Mandarin. You have been serving in Taiwan. Later on, after Mongolia, also to Africa. So this sort of you are U.S. diplomat, now retired, but you have been representing your country, and you are. What does it take to be a diplomat in the United States of America?
Well, technically, in order to become a Foreign Service officer, you take a written exam. If you pass the written, you take an oral, and then there's the medical and the security checks. It's a self-selected process, and it's not necessarily very easy, particularly the oral part. But once you get in, it's like the military service. For us, it's we are commissioned officers, like a military officer. So you start at the bottom and you work your way up. And if you are good, you eventually become an ambassador. And I was among a group of women. The Foreign Service until 1972, the Foreign Service did not allow women officers to marry. If you were a female officer and you married, you had to resign.
Wow.
In 1981, they changed the law, and they invited a lot of women to come back, and they also opened it up to more women. So I was part of this group that was pushing the envelope, as they say, or the glass ceiling, as we say. And for instance, I was the first female deputy director of the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs. I was the first female ambassador to Mongolia. Many firsts. So I'm quite proud of that. I think to be a successful diplomat, first of all, you have to be a good manager. I think Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, made the point very well. She called us her CEOs. An embassy was like a corporation. The ambassadors were the CEOs.
Wow.
And we were in charge of making sure that the money was taken care of. We had to account for money and programs and people. And teamwork and morale was very important. So a large part of what I did was just managing the embassy. In Nairobi, it's the largest embassy in Africa. We had 400 Americans and 1,200 Kenyans. It was a huge mission. So I spent all my time there just managing the people and the money and the programs. In smaller countries, I was ambassador to Burundi. That was my last assignment. We had only 12 Americans.
After Mongolia, you were ambassador to Burundi.
After Mongolia, I went to Kenya as the deputy chief of mission.
Okay.
And then from Kenya to Burundi as the chief of mission or ambassador. It was a very small embassy. And I spent most of my time, though, dealing with the situation in Burundi. They had just finished with the civil war. They went through a very difficult election, and then they started killing each other again. So my role was more to reach out to the government and the people to try and stop the violence. And I had a good deputy in Burundi who took care of the embassy. So a lot of it depends on the country.
Quite much spectrum of countries, people. And by the way, what was the hardest day in your life being an American ambassador?
The hardest day, again, as ambassador, and I was ambassador twice, was a day in Burundi, actually, when just after or during the elections, the first time they'd had elections in 20 years.
Which year it was?
This was 2010.
Okay,
2010,
3 years ago.
3 years ago. And we thought everything had gone peacefully, and then we started to hear gunshots and realized that things were not going well. And from there, the election sort of spun out of control. Many of the parties withdrew. And it was discouraging because we had worked so hard to make sure that the election went well.
Is it settled down now?
Yes and no. Many of the opposition politicians fled the country because they were afraid for their lives. They have come back. The United Nations has a very large presence in Burundi, not peacekeepers, but there to sort of make sure that everyone is treated properly. So it was a very, very difficult situation because it was dangerous.
I see.
I think that's what I'm saying. The high point, though, was Mongolia.
All right. What was the great day?
Well, the day I welcomed President Bush
to
Mongolia. It was just, he was only here, I think, 6 hours.
Your
but it
father
was a full day.
Your father is still alive?
No, my father died in 2009.
2000, just 1 year.
Yeah.
No, he has seen you were standing.
Yes, yes.
So probably he was very proud of.
My father visited me here in Mongolia, and then he also was able to participate when I was sworn in for Burundi. He was present. Yes.
Okay, happy moment.
Very.
Good daughter, huh? It's great.
Family tradition. Unfortunately, I have none of the children are going to continue this, I think. But.
By the way, now you, as a retired American ambassador, you are still keep busy with the missions. They are sending you to do certain jobs. You are active, and what are you doing now?
Well, I'm
other than chairperson of the North American Mongol Business Council.
Other than my hobby. I work part-time for the State Department's Office of the Inspector General. Okay. And as a retired ambassador, I lead a team, and we have regular inspections of embassies. So this year I inspected our embassy in Morocco and our embassy in Lebanon.
In which perspectives? I mean, in all economics?
We look at everything. The team is usually 12 people, and they look at everything. My task is to talk to the ambassador.
Okay.
In some cases, ambassadors are doing well. In other cases, they're not doing so well. So counseling, as well as we write a written report on what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong.
What a great structure. Because in this country, our ambassadors retired. They must keep writing some books and the memoir. But instead, if they are used for making sure the other embassies, that would be, I think, great experience for Mongolian Foreign Service. And also, tell us about that oral history. What are you doing on that?
Yes, we were talking about that before. This is an organization that is associated with the Foreign Service. And it began, I think, 5 years ago. Retired officers are invited to be interviewed. And for me, it was about 20 hours of interview over the telephone. And it walks through the history. They want to know about your social background and the high points and low points. The goal of this, though, is then they transcribe it, and I can edit it. And it goes on the Library of Congress website, the U.S. Library of Congress, which is the largest library. And it serves as a research tool. So somebody who wants to do a paper or research into, say, U.S.-Mongolia relations, they have my oral history. And hopefully other ambassadors and other officers who've served here will also
What a wonderful memoir.
It's a great way to capture, before it's lost, personal people who were, as we say, present at the creation, or present during the events. Otherwise, that information is lost.
Well, your last 2 points themselves, I think, a great intellectual contribution towards what we could do here, because it's a small country, obviously, and we better to learn from the best experiences. Ambassador, so my final questions. What's the plan with North America Mongolia Business Council?
Well, we'll continue to push forward. You were the meetings today. I think we're cautiously optimistic that the special session of Parliament will indeed produce an outcome that will send a message, a positive message to investors of stability and predictability, and that will raise investors' confidence in Mongolia. So I would hope that 2014 would be a better year, and that at our annual investors conference next September, we'll have twice as many people attending.
Here, and in spring, early spring, you will have in...
We have our annual general meeting. This year, because we're binational, we represent Canada and the United States. In 2014, it will be in Ottawa.
And speaking about that, this is 40th, this particular year you celebrate a big day.
Yes.
Right?
Well, as I say, we represent Canada as well as the United States. So this year we're celebrating 40 years of Mongolia-Canada relations. Just like last year, we celebrated 25 years of Mongolia-United States relations. So.
You know, Pamela, we are friends. We're working together on certain foreign relations issues, probably for me being from a civic society part. And you know, Mongolians are very happy to see you back in this capacity, which is, I think, in a very meaningful way, will be very helpful to solve thoroughly many issues we face today. And I think this, your first NAMBEC conference today was key to that.
Thank you.
And I would like to thank you and your colleague Steve Sanders for your wonderful job today.
Yes.
And see you next year here back.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.